Welcome to Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Its program Represent NYC. I'm State Senator Robert Jackson, representing the 31st Senatorial District, 13 miles of Manhattan, and we're here with several guests to speak about education and diversity in education. And so let me introduce Natasha Capers. Natasha is an education activist, and I'm going to give her 2 minutes to introduce herself and what she does. And then we turn to Matt Gonzales, and Matt will introduce himself and what organization he's affiliated with, and then we can get into the show.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me today. I am Natasha Capers. I use all pronouns in dignity, respect, love, and humanity, and I am the director of the New York City Coalition for Educational Justice, where we unapologetically organize parents from Black, Latinx, immigrant, and indigenous communities across all 5 boroughs at the intersection of racial justice and educational justice for better outcomes for all children in New York City.
Thank you for coming in on the show this morning, and let's turn to Matt Gonzales. Matt, who are you and who do you work for and what are you representing in this program of Represent NYC?
Sure. Well, hi everybody. My name is Matt Gonzales. I use he, him pronouns. I'm actually a resident of Inwood, so I live in Senator Jackson's district. So I'm a resident here. I'm an educator, an activist, an organizer. I get paid by the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. In that role, I oversee our work, our policy, our advocacy, our research around the issue of school desegregation, school integration. I wear a variety of hats and get to work with Natasha and CEJ often and regularly and many other folks. But I've been the policy coach for the youth organization Integrate NYC for the past 5 years. Actually, I was just joking that they've had my Friday evenings for the last 5 years because we meet every Friday evening. And so I'm also a coordinator for New Yorkers for Racially Just Public Schools, which is a coalition of advocacy organizations, youth parents, educators who have come together to really shape the discussion and the public debate around the mayoral election in New York City and the upcoming conversation. So my work is expansive, and it's super awesome to be in this conversation with Natasha and you, Senator Jackson.
Well, thank you both for coming in. And so I'm going to throw out a couple of questions, and I'd like to hear your response and regarding those questions, knowing how involved both of you are in education. So here, think about this. What are the 2 or 3 most important things at this point in time with regards to education? Let's start with you, Natasha. Just quickly, the 3 most important things, and we're gonna see whether or not we line up together with Matt and myself, and we can get into it.
So there's so many important things, and I think one of the most important is that we have to get back to centering children and what is best for children and what is actually educationally sound for children. Right now, the system is very centered on what is best for adults and how adults feel, and we have to actually center the educational system back on children. CJ has worked really hard around things like culturally responsive education, wraparound services, and community schools. So I definitely would leave those things at the core, right? We have to exercise racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia out of our system. And the only way to do it is to do it. And so we have to really get clear about why we're doing that work, who is doing that work, and if you're not wanting to do that work, why? And why are you in the system? And funding, as always, like.
Now you're going past 3. I said you got to leave room for Matt to come in.
My bad.
No, well, that's good. I mean, I would say because Natasha and I get to work so closely together, there's a lot of alignment in, I think, the top priorities. I would say I echo everything Natasha laid out. Just to add a couple items, I think particularly right now, as we're going to consider, at some point having young people back in schools, particularly our high school young people. I work with a lot of young folks, and the fact that they spent last summer getting beat up by the NYPD for really expressing their First Amendment right, and the fact that they're going to have to actually enter back into schools with the presence of potentially armed law enforcement and kind of the culture of policing. And so I guess one of the key issues that I'm really feeling energy around and young folks are really elevating is the issue of police, not just the physical presence of police officers and school resource and school safety agents, but the culture of policing as it exists in schools and the way that we criminalize Black and brown bodies and the ways that they live naturally in our world, right? So that's one thing. Obviously, my work has been very much around integration and desegregation, and so dismantling the various tools of segregation that this administration, prior administrations, decades of administrations have implemented and upheld. So, dismantling the various tools that facilitate educational segregation are key for me. And then again, like for me, if you're going to bring people together from diverse backgrounds, if you're not doing the work around culturally responsive education and restorative justice that Natasha was just naming, then we're actually doing a disservice to and not really reaping the benefits of diverse classrooms. So, police, desegregation, and CRE for me.
But considering that we're all basically all over the place in our homes, and many people are working from home like we are right now, how are you going to get everyone together? Can we do this in order to move forward with goals and objectives in the next year or 2 years via Zoom, or do we going to have to come back and meet in person in order to network on the issues of segregation in schools, as far as funding in schools, as far as responsive curriculum in school? How can we do that? I mean, can we just do that over Zoom?
All right, well, I'll jump in first. So what I would say is, I long for the moments where we can be in space together, where I can be like, where I can hug Natasha and just like, disrupt a meeting with Natasha because we're not paying attention, and to be with my young people. So like, I think for me, as someone who's always been an organizer, that's key and critical for my like, that's part of my love language. That's how I want to exist in the world. That being said, like, we're in a global pandemic still, and actually what we also know is that people that look like us on this call are being more disproportionately harmed by the damage of this pandemic and are actually having less access to vaccines. And so I already know that there will be an opportunity to reopen this city and this country that is not going to be afforded to Black and brown low income New Yorkers. And so until we can get to that space, I think we all have looked really hard and worked hard to find ways to be human on Zoom and to like create community over in virtual spaces. I would actually pass to Natasha because I think Natasha has been one of the most effective folks at holding space on Zoom with hundreds of people that are drawing people in. So I'll stop there and kind of let Natasha shine on the greatness of Zoom.
It's a yes and yes, right? We need all the things, right? We have to be able to, at some point, we're going to come back in person and love up on each other. Some of it's going to be social distance. Some of it might be up close and personal. But Zoom and virtual spaces are going to be a part of our regular lives from now on, and probably a regular part of school from now on, right? So the fact that snow days may not be a thing anymore, like, because we're just remote, right? But there are ways to build community. There are ways to continue to build the work has not stopped. Like, the work has not stopped because we've been virtual, and we've just been able to build. You're able to build more communities. You can build smaller spaces, but have more of them. There's so many different ways to continue to have these beautiful conversations that we're even having right now, through Zoom, through in person, through phone, through letters, through, carrier pigeons, whatever makes it work.
Letters? You mean people still write letters?
I mean,
Of
I don't.
course they do. Hey, but Natasha and Matt, let me ask both of you. Here's a question. Brown versus the Board of Education was decided in 1954 in favor of integration. And how come we are still talking about segregation in the largest school district in the country in 2021?
What I'll say is that the foundation of the American public education system was designed to exclude Black and Indigenous people. We built a system atop of that was racially segregated. I think for me, why we're still talking about it is, one, there was only a span of 10 to 15 years where the federal government, states actively tried to desegregate schools. And actually, there's always this narrative that integration failed, actually where it was actively done, it was, there were positive impacts, right? Also negative impacts. So what I would say is that because there was an active effort to dismantle desegregation integration initiatives through the federal government, through the Supreme Court, and also through local actions by elected officials and mostly white parents. Right, there was critical massive resistance to desegregation that was part of why various functions of it turned into, well, let's just fight for money, let's just fight for more black teachers, let's fight for these things. And so what I would say is the reason we've tried to bring the conversation back today is I see it as one of the root causes of the various forms of inequity and racism in our system. And so you can't have you have a Eurocentric system because we built a segregated system for white kids. You have a racially segregated system because we've created tools to separate black and brown kids. And I think, again, the function of separation is not about just separating us from each other. It's about separating us from power, from resources, from opportunity, from teachers that look like us. And so for me, the segregation is like the root cause. The various things that we just talked about as solutions and the issues are really how we want to repair the harm that's caused. I'll pause and let Natasha pick up from there.
Yeah, and I'll say that I think that there are two core reasons why we're still talking about it the way we're having to talk about it today. One is the fundamental piece around that case was not actually about Black students wanting to go into white schools, right? It wasn't actually about integrating those spaces, that it was challenging the notion of separate and equal, but saying like, they're saying was like, we want those same resources. We want the things. We want the things that you have versus necessarily having to come out of our own communities, come out of our own spaces, to then be in schools with you. And because what we start to see after that is the decline in Black teachers. We start to see the decline in practices that actually elevated learning for Black and brown students, because the core piece of it wasn't necessarily about the kumbaya of let's all be in one space together, but it was about, we want these things. We want the same funding. We want the same access. We want the same facilities. And that is still the exact same rallying cry across. Is the fundamental piece around CFE. We want the money. You owe us funding. Give it to us now, right? And then the other piece is redlining, right? Nobody wants to talk about the history of redlining, especially in cities like New York City. So when people say, well, why are the neighborhoods the way they are? Why are schools segregated? It's because we have zones and children go to school, especially when they're young, near their home.
By the zip code, in essence, zip code.
Zip code. Mm-hmm. But what we don't talk about is the history of redlining, which created these neighborhoods of high poverty that also are Black and brown communities, which also have schools that are underfunded, right? And so like all of those historical mechanisms for keeping Black and brown folks segregated and in impoverished conditions still are very much prevalent today. And we have actually not done any of the work to undo that.
Let's focus on New York City right now. You have District 2, where the preference for admissions to the schools are in District 2. They get the first choices. And as you know, the highest income brackets in the city of New York is on the Upper East Side. We know that, okay? But also, you know that the mayor and the chancellor and moving forward on integration. So what is stopping it happening in New York City, besides redlining, besides zip codes? What else, in your opinion, is stopping the type of integration that we need? And in your opinion, Matt, what type of integration are we looking for in the school system?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what's stopping it, I'll be very simple. This guy named Bill de Blasio is actually actively obstructing, and has been actively obstructing the work to implement policies to promote desegregation and integration. So that's we do. Chancellor Carranza is going to be out of office, and I think there's a lot of narrative of that being part of that reason, right? And so I would say let's put the responsibility where it lies on the mayor. I would say what we want is what youth from Integrate NYC have articulated, and the School Diversity Advisory Group, which I sat on a couple of years ago, has also articulated as called the 5 R's of real integration. And again, it's really talking about not just the movement of bodies, but the movement of resources, power, opportunity, and culture, really, so that we can create systems that are affirming. And so we want desegregation. So we want to dismantle policies like the use of a racist G&T test for gifted and talented. We want to eliminate the various barriers that are created to access schools. This is every school should be accessible to every young person in this city. And so that's one piece, is like dismantling the like actual tools of segregation that facilitate separation. The larger piece, and what was laid out in the School Diversity Advisory Group, was that those are the desegregation policies, but the integration policies are actually what do you do in the classroom. And so addressing what Natasha just laid out, like there has been a dearth of Black educators in this city, across this country, for generations, and that's a pattern that we need to disrupt. And so we need to build more Black and brown educators in the classroom. There's research on that, the value of that, just having one Black teacher, right? And so the like creating the conditions around culturally responsive schools, around restorative practices, around schools that affirm and value all families regardless of their linguistic background. That's the work that we're working for. And like, yes, let's dismantle racist policies wherever they exist, but we can also actively be working to elevate the schools who have been serving Black and brown young folks for generations and decades, and doing it with love and care, and beautiful practices, but doing it at the deficit.
Now, Natasha, you're an advocate. You're an activist, okay? Your Highness, I asked you this question. Knowing the situation that we're in a transition from Chancellor Carranza to the new incoming chancellor, who was born, raised, and educated in New York City, a woman of color, a Black woman.
First Black woman to be chancellor, get it?
So what do you think about that? And how do you think that, what effect is she going to have in dismantling the segregated racism that exists in our system? And is she going to be allowed to continue?
Even the question of, will she be able to lead under de Blasio? Because what we have seen over the last 2 years is de Blasio really having this strange want of control of every decision coming out of the DOE, it feels like, right? And so really seeing, will she be able to come and bring her full self? I have so much hope and confidence that she will be able to. She is a part of the system. You know, sometimes we don't always want to acknowledge that that education policy is political policy, right? Like that it is that. And so sometimes you have to be able to get into the muck and the mire, know where the bodies are buried, understand the history and the context. And Chancellor Porter has all of that at her disposal because she has been a part of the system for so long. And because she's come from the Bronx, because she's represented some of the most underfunded districts, some of the hardest hit districts due to COVID, some of the districts that have some of the most diverse linguistic needs, some of the highest rates of like special needs students, that she has a very clear lens of the system in a way that her counterparts have not, right? And so I am really excited, and I'm excited to see what will happen. Will she have another chance at this? Because, 10 months at this is not going to be enough for her to enact her full vision. And I know she's going to come with a full vision.
Some people say that education is not only local, but it's also governed by the state of New York. Now we have the commissioner now for the state education department, Betty Rosa, and we have Lester Young Jr. as the new chancellor for the State Board of Regents. Understanding that they are both people of color, how soon are we going to have at the statewide level an opening in order to move forward towards the curriculum that's culturally diverse, as far as moving forward with the Amistad Commission goals and objectives about slavery, so that children, especially Black children and everybody else, know the history of our country with slavery. How, in your opinion, that's going to have an impact on what's happening in New York City?
I like Natasha's last question. That was an easier question than this one. Yeah, I mean, I would say I think there's this opportunity right now, and I think Misha, as Natasha was saying, represents it. I actually think Chancellor Carranza kind of represented this opportunity of alignment between some state policy makers and city priorities. And so just as an example, I think the culturally responsive and sustaining framework that was outlined by the state a couple years back really helped drive some work we were doing in the city with CEJ, like led by CEJ, to ensure that there was a definition for culturally responsive education in New York. And so I think that kind of dynamic between like seeing what the state is prioritizing and how we can leverage that in the city, I want to see more of that happen. I think particularly because we're in this moment where we're transitioning leadership in the city, and it's going to be a potentially dramatic shift in leadership, or at least who is going to be in that role, right? And so I'm hopeful that and I think just knowing, the work of Dr. Young and knowing, Betty Rosa and their priorities, I'm really hopeful there's going to be an alignment between all of those folks in leadership in the city. I guess what I will say is that this really beautiful trifecta of like Black and brown women in leadership positions, like there's a shadow, or I guess a shadow of two white men over both of their control, like, Bill de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, who both, again, in various different directions have been actively undermining racially just public schools and priorities. And so again, I think Natasha said there's a game of politics here often that are kind of gross and gets in the way of actually centering young people. And so I'm really hopeful that all those amazing alignments can happen. I'm worried about the governor and the way that Bill de Blasio are going to obstruct that.
Natasha, here's this for you. Understanding what is needed. Do you think that we have the resources in order to get it done? Because what you're talking about is a whole transition, and quite frankly, money plays into that. So tell me about what do we need in order to get all of this done, so that our children down the road will have the most integrated, diverse type of education that we want all of our kids to have.
I mean, in a time of COVID where the rich literally got richer, there is more than enough money. The question, I mean, is there the political will, right? So will the governor and the legislative bodies do what is right and like tax the rich, right? Like, will we do that? Will we do that, right? Will we tax the rich? The federal stimulus that came down from Biden and Harris, and even though when that came down in December, lays out money for schools. The question is, will the governor actually release those dollars to schools? Because there's so much there that will not only allow folks to bring back just the floor of schools because of this year, will actually allow them to elevate it, especially if we get that taxing the rich and the revenue pieces right, that there will no longer be, like, we will actually elevate the floor so high that we have to elevate the ceiling as well. And so the real question is, will the powers that be use their powers and do what's right, not just for New Yorkers across the state, but do what is right for children across the state?
Next to this specialized high school exam that is governed by the state of New York. Should we keep it in place or get rid of it? So thumbs up or thumbs down? Matt? Okay, thumbs down. Okay. So in essence, who should decide whether or not there is an exam or not? Should that be a local decision or should that be a statewide decision, in your opinion?
I mean, the fact is that the SHAZAT, the specialized high school exam, actually only governs 5 schools in New York City. It should not be under state purview. It should absolutely be under New York City purview. But also, let's remember the racist history of this exam, that the specialized high schools come about to fight against white flight out of the city. It is a way to build private schools the education system of a private school without actually having to pay the money for a private school, which was part of the incentive to keep wealthier white families in New York City as they were starting to flee to the suburbs.
Matt, if you want to comment on this for 30 seconds, and then we're going to come to closings from you and Natasha.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Echo everything Natasha said. I just will say that zero institutions of higher education, of high school, besides the specialized high schools and our gifted and talented system in New York City, use a single admissions test, one data point to create access. It is racist, it is classist, and it is actually educationally, like educational malpractice. That's all.
Closing statements, 45 seconds each. Natasha and then Matt.
We actually, as a city, have to do what's right for children, and that means getting our education system right. Even as we think about the future of our city, our system is designed to produce students that are good at a work system that does not even exist anymore. And we actually need to bring our education system up to par. Our schools should be places that our children deserve, and they are not right now.
I'll be quick. Yeah, I'll, as always, echo everything Natasha said. I'd say we have an opportunity right here in New York City where we're going to elect a new mayor. We're going to elect an entirely new city council. There's a huge shift and an opportunity to transform the way that leadership decides education should be done. Educationforliberation.org is a website for New Yorkers for racially just public schools. We already have a platform. We're already prioritizing and elevating the key issues that need to be in discussion. Join the conversation and make sure we're holding everyone who's trying to run accountable. Thanks.
We're here on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and the program is Represent NYC. I'm State Senator Robert Jackson. We're joined by Matt Gonzales and Natasha Capers, two education activists fighting for the best for our children, not only in New York City, but around the state. Let me thank you both for coming in today and giving your time and energy, because we need your time and your energy in order to move forward to ensure that every child, no matter who you are, whether you're Black, white, Latino, Asian, rich or poor, get a good education in the New York City Department of Education and the state education-wide. So I'd like to thank you both for coming in to Manhattan Neighborhood Network, Represent NYC.